Quote, there is a link. They all rejected or reject the notion of possession as the purpose of life, whether it be of a woman's body or a high profit at all costs, or of the right to dictate the speed of progress. The scientist is but one more form and will be superseded, end quote. It was trade that killed the idea of the Victorian gentleman, and it is the lust for power that is killing the modern scientist. But the mere lust for power does not kill. The actual murder instrument is the administrative process created to handle all that power. Before explaining the mechanism of the destruction, I want to give 4 brief examples, each of them from biology, which is my field, and each of them British. Just to show you that this is not just a topic that is American. First was the sale by Mrs. Thatcher's government of much of the plant breeding laboratory in Cambridge to the Unilever Corporation. Whatever the merits of the sale, and nobody can think of any, it had the effect of diminishing the laboratory as a creative force in science, since most of its best people left and came over here. We at Rutgers were lucky enough to get the boss, Peter Day, who was now the head of our biotechnology unit in agriculture. Second was the fairly recent edict by the University's Funding Council, which was formerly the University Grants Committee, their NSF, NIH, the organization that controls the funding of academic science in Britain, to condense all biology departments with less than 20 faculty into larger units of only 2 types. A B type, which would concentrate on cells, organisms, and ecology, and an M type, which would study only molecular topics. This should fairly quickly ruin most of what is left of British biology, first B and then M. Third was the British government's decision to close the Brogdale Experimental Horticultural Station in Kent by April of 1990. Brogdale has probably the world's best collection of living varieties of apple, not to mention pear, plum, cherry, and bush fruits. The government promised to maintain the collections. In the United States, as we have seen, at the National Seed Storage Laboratory at Fort Collins, we know what happens when bureaucrats promise to take care of our precious heritage of fruits and vegetables and grains. The British are not likely to fare any better than we have. They also were planning, in addition to closing Brogdale, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food planned to close the Rosewarne Station in Cornwall, which new scientists described as a unique site for research into early winter vegetables, and they were considering closing the vegetable gene bank at Wellesbourne in Warwickshire. Fourth was the administrative termination of research on birds, arachnids, and coelenterates, not very important creatures, at the Tring branch of the British Museum, and the gutting of all ornithology elsewhere in the British Museum. Events very similar in character and motivation to what was happening at the same time in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Each of these 4 examples were brought to pass because management was invited in to help control and enhance the flow of power emanating from modern science. It should not surprise anyone when the goals of administration are substituted for the societal goals that science once appeared to accept. But the administratively imposed death of science is being caused by more tangible factors than the alteration of science's objectives. There are direct causes, including most obviously its cost. Science is pricing itself out of existence, and not just the big science described recently by the New York Times in a very interesting series. The skyrocketing cost of equipment, supplies, and salaries is not an inherent part of modern science. Projects with high operating costs are carefully selected and favored by administrators because the administration receives a percentage of the operating costs through overhead. A percentage of a big number is more money than a percentage of a little number. Research that is spare and economical is therefore automatically suspect. Because it costs little money, it brings in little money. Such research by administrative definition is not world class. Another one of those wonderful terms. I noticed that Iowa State, like every other land-grant university I've ever been to claims that it is about to become number one. Same process. In justification of this policy, we hear self-serving arguments that scientific research creates more societal wealth than it consumes. Apart from the fact that there isn't the slightest proof of this assertion, there's also no reason why expensive research should prove more beneficial than inexpensive research. Often the opposite is true. My university, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, is a national leader in the effort to pour huge amounts of money into high-tech science, far more than is being done here, for example. My subjective impression is that we are now coming up with fewer discoveries of value to the public than we did 10 years ago. And we are about to witness the spectacle of fabulously expensive new buildings standing empty and locked because the university is too drained of resources to operate them. The only plaque that you'll see as you walk into what is now the administration building at Cook, the land-grant part of Rutgers, is a very lovely bronze plaque which says something to the effect of, here in the laboratories of microbiology were discovered streptomycin and actinomycin, products of great benefit to humankind, something like that. But it doesn't say that they were essentially discovered in the basement. Meanwhile, pre-existing research and all teaching is in disarray because of the chaos caused by perpetual reorganization, which is a hallmark of modern management. With dwindling resources and mounting debt, only the most stubbornly unobservant can expect the scientific gravy train to keep on running much longer. What we can expect in the coming years is a stream of theories and inventions which are supposed to create wealth and power out of inexhaustible commodities such as seawater. Nuclear power was an early example, now curdled and gone sour. Superconductivity and cold fusion are recent illustrations. All promise much for very little. All would maintain the power and growth of the scientific, technical, managerial system that created them. This is a form of magical thinking, grafted onto real physical, chemical, and biological processes, bred by a mixture of greed and desperation. There are other ways in which administration is killing science directly, for example, by consuming the creative energies of scientists in paperwork. But I want to go on to an indirect cause of death, one that has major environmental implications. For want of a better term, I call this the problem of de-skilling. I don't think that was my word. It sounded somewhere. De-skilling is a very ugly new word, which denotes an even uglier process, the progressive draining of practical knowledge from a culture, a loss of skills by virtue of the loss of skilled practitioners to use them. When it was decided to begin work again in New York's vast Cathedral of St. John the Divine, after a lapse of decades, a few old men in England were the only stonemasons left on earth who knew how to work the giant blocks from which a cathedral is built. If they hadn't been able to train young apprentices, as they did in Harlem, there might have been no choice but to abandon the project. I think our concept of progress prevents us from being aware that skills and knowledge can vanish from the world. Most of us picture knowledge as cumulative. Each advance is built on prior discoveries, block piled upon block in an ever-growing edifice. We don't think of the blocks underneath as crumbling away, or better yet, better image, simply vanishing. Pop. Our worldview does not prepare us for this, although it's hardly a new phenomenon in the world. The loss of knowledge. Oliver Goldsmith was writing about the loss of peasant agricultural skills when he penned these lines in The Deserted Village, published in 1770. Ill fares the land to hastening ills of prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. Princes or lords may flourish or may fade, a breath can make them as a breath is made. But of old peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied. Loss of knowledge and skills is now a big problem in our universities, and no subject is in greater danger of disappearing than our long-accumulated knowledge of the natural world. The problem is so serious that I've called it the next environmental crisis. One of the things I've written. We're on the verge of losing our ability, for example, to tell one plant or animal from another, and forgetting how the known species interact among themselves and with their environment. At Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, with a population of 7.5 million people, there is now only one professor emeritus who is a plant taxonomist. One person who is fully capable of instructing and telling one plant from another. What happens when he retires all the way, as he threatens to do all the time? What is happening is that the teaching of the part of biology devoted to the study of biological diversity, taxonomy, natural history, ethology, comparative physiology, biogeography, and allied subjects is disappearing from the curriculum in many schools. Maybe not this one, I don't know. The modern administrative climate is hostile to this kind of biology, to those who study and teach it. Our functional understanding of biodiversity is still in its late infancy, and never has the subject been so important to our existence. Yet these kinds of riches have no value to university administrators. Taxonomy, biogeography, and comparative biochemistry, to give a few examples, get very few and insignificant grants. Therefore, these subjects do not support enough administrators to make them worth keeping. Here's another very ominous positive feedback loop. That is, the fewer research programs and courses there are in these subjects, the fewer people there will be to teach the next generation of students. You can't learn this stuff from books. Up to a point you can, but not all the way. Where will we be when there isn't a soul left who can tell one kind of grass from another, or anyone who knows the habits of grasshoppers? Nor is de-skilling confined to cathedral building or the practice of science. My colleagues tell me it's going on in philosophy, in military training, and the manufacture of weapons, in our agriculture, and in all our interactions with nature. It pervades our culture, eating away at it from within. Admiral Rickover, the founder of the modern nuclear navy, once told me in a phone conversation that he was scared to death that there would soon no longer be anyone in the Pentagon left who knew how to fight with conventional weapons, and that therefore the Pentagon was gearing itself up for inevitable wars, nuclear wars, because that was the only thing that people knew how to do, or thought they knew how to do. That was the man who founded the nuclear navy. If he was frightened, think what we ought to be. It can't be denied that the consequences of the management glut are both deep and pervasive. Modern management, insulated from the actions it regulates, causes damage through countless bad decisions. For similar reasons, it hinders the efforts to rectify its own mistakes. It demoralizes the producers, and as I've indicated, its actions are draining the reservoirs of skills and knowledge that we need now and we'll need even more in the future. Can we resolve this crisis of over-administration? Can anything bring the bureaucracy to heel? I think the answer to this question is readily apparent, but it won't be terribly satisfying to most of us. Management, like anything undergoing perpetual growth, including cancer, will eventually bring itself under control by running out of resources. It's doing that now. It will self-destruct. It is self-destructing as I speak to you. I'm tempted to say, read my lips. This will be hastened by the tendency of management to cripple the producers, the people who provide the wealth in the first place. Because it incorporates so many positive feedback loops, modern management is inherently unstable. But the breakdown of the bureaucracy may take more time than we can afford to wait, and its loss may be small comfort if the rest of society is left a bankrupt ruin. Many of the problems the world faces, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, the hole in the ozone layer, the greenhouse effect, the international agricultural crisis, deforestation, loss of species, the decline of education, the loss of human cultures, need to be addressed quickly and effectively. Bureaucracy is preventing that effective response. Can we do anything to put management back in its proper place before it is too late? Before attempting to give what little constructive answer I can, I have to at least mention the issue of overpopulation, which fits in. Overpopulation is partly responsible for all the environmental problems that I listed. Is it also responsible for the management of glut, in part? I said in my introduction that management historically appears to have been an urban phenomenon. It depends upon high densities of people and the concentrations of complex activities and power that high densities of people generate. Now that we have sprawling conurbations rather than cities with computers to help overcome the problems of control brought about by distance, bureaucracy has been liberated from its urban context, but only because so much more of the world has become a city. With so many people interacting in so many ways in a technologically complex world, we have to ask whether intensive management is an unavoidable accompaniment to overpopulation. Does it provide a short-term stability, which is the only alternative to chaos? I don't know the answer. But I don't think we ought to assume the game is lost before we start to play. Simple deterministic ideas of the future are usually wrong. Let's hope that the notion that overpopulation makes overmanagement inevitable is no exception to that rule. Now, to curb managerial excess, the first thing that comes to my mind is shutting off the money tap or at least slowing the flow. Bureaucratic growth consumes expensive office space and is labor-intensive and therefore costs a great deal of money. But because the administrators control institutional budgets, it is hard to reduce their funding. I know of only a few cases where this has been done. For example, in the United States, the Internal Revenue Service now effectively limits the percentage of its income that a nonprofit foundation can spend on the administration of its grants. In this instance, one organization is limiting the administrative expenditures of others. The limit is imposed from outside. One can imagine informed taxpayers putting pressure on governmental granting agencies to standardize and sharply reduce the allowable overhead given to institutions as part of research and service grants. If adopted by the major granting agencies as a policy, let's say no more overheads greater than 20%, or a standard 20% across the board, or 10%, I'd like to see 8%. If adopted by major granting agencies, the first effect would be considerable disruption and a certain amount of chaos. But such a policy would, I think, fairly soon do much to restore teaching of all subjects, as well as research in unglamorous fields such as taxonomy and natural history, because managers would no longer be preoccupied with the pursuit of huge grants for their overhead, nor would there be so many managers. Besides reducing the money supply for management, the other methods of controlling the controllers, I think, suggest themselves. And this all has to be pioneered. Positive feedback loops can be eliminated if producers can participate at some level in the hiring and firing of administrators. Even more effective would be the breaking down of the work barriers between the non-producers and the producers through rotation of jobs. This sort of system was pioneered in the United States by the U.S. Geological Survey. I don't know if they still do it. I haven't asked lately. Where most administrative desk jobs were limited to a tenure of about 5 years at most. And this was followed by a stint, an equal stint of service in the field. And of course, when this happens, administrative abuses are tremendously curtailed. Because if you behave in an arbitrary way when you're an administrator, 6 months later, when you're out in the field and the guy you were arbitrary to is an administrator, you hear about it. Widespread implementation of these kinds of reforms to shift power away from management will be very difficult without a revolutionary vision of the relationship between producers and non-producers. The central assumption of bureaucracy is that the individual producer is subordinate to a larger system rather than to a fallible person or persons. Only by rejecting the central assumption can producers hope to regain their share of the world. How do we reject it? Well, personal anonymity of the managers and institutional anonymity concerning the internal structure and procedures of administration and management are essential features of what we could call hyper-managerial control. To the managee, a manager is always defined by his or her title, not really by personal attributes. It is much more difficult to argue with a position than a person, especially if the position itself is in shadow. You don't really know what it's about. But this anonymity is potentially one of the most vulnerable parts of bureaucratic power. All that is needed to begin to fight the non-producers is some bright light. Lists of major and minor administrators, with brief biographical sketches and accurate job descriptions. How many people at my university know that at the main New Brunswick campuses, the associate provost for personnel is a man who was refused tenure in the English department? And what does that imply for his actions, especially with regard to women and minorities? Pamphlets showing the salaries of administrators and their staffs, and if possible, office expenses. Organizational charts of the bureaucracy, with graphs showing its growth during the past 10 or 20 years. I once did this for the State Department, using their old phone books and a recent phone book, and showed that as the number of embassies declined around the world, went down like this, the number of administrators was going up like this. The two curves intersecting just like the traditional supply and demand curve, but not logically. In the Columbia University protests of 1968, the most effective single device for bringing down the university administration was a little pamphlet widely distributed entitled Who Rules Columbia? It's just an organizational chart. Related strategies suggest themselves. Why not send questionnaires to the managers, demanding the kinds of professional and personal information that the producers are continually being asked to supply? If the questionnaires are not returned, no matter. The act of sending them redefines the relationship between the managers and the managed. Of course, such spotlight strategies are not applicable to all bureaucracies, and there's always the problem of who will bell the cat. Certainly not non-tenured assistant professors. In some cases of managerial explosion, especially governmental, relief will have to come from outside. This relief effort has never been organized, although I have no doubt it will be. The force of angry consumers is considerable. Angry producers, rather. In the United States, both Presidents Carter and Reagan won elections by promising to curb governmental bureaucracy, although both ended up by making it worse. There is still no serious strategy for this task, no group of activists uniquely dedicated to its completion. One problem is that overmanagement is a revolutionary challenge. The old political dichotomies of liberal versus conservative and labor versus capital don't fit very well. New battle lines are not yet drawn. The fight, I think, is coming. Christopher Lasch's new book, I think he called something like The True and Perfect Heaven, describes the discovery by a traditional liberal of these very interesting new battle lines that are being drawn. Let me conclude by saying that to survive with many good features of our society, our environment, and our educational system intact and functioning well, we must solve the problem of bureaucracy before it solves itself. Surely, once the problem is widely identified, we will make some progress towards the solution. Nevertheless, honesty requires that I state that as long as we continue to be a power-worshipping society, dominated by the myth of control, we doom ourselves to some excess of administration, which goes with control, and to all the misery that this entails. Our task is to find a way to convert a power economy to a life economy, in Lewis Mumford's words. In the language of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verse 19, the injunction is even more direct. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore choose life that you may live, you and your seed. Thank you. I realize that most of you are here longer than you wanted to be. I'll be happy to answer any questions, either just personally or now. Yeah.
You're aware that